Hi, everyone. Welcome back to NYU Game Center's lecture series. I'm Maddie, and I'm going to be introducing Gita Jackson, who is our featured speaker today. So just very quickly, I believe I met Gita obviously somewhere on Twitter. And this was at a time where it was quite rare to see people making references to media, art, music, especially those related to people of color, as influences for games. It was really fun seeing. I feel like Gita has a very particular style of not respecting a sort of low versus high brow kind of binary, I would say, and kind of like what is mass media is just as interesting as what is maybe less mass media. And I feel like when we met in person, I want to say we were on a fashion in games panel. Yes. We were at Indiecade.
With Tim Rogers.
Yeah, with Tim Rogers and Christine Love. I think that's what it was. And it was one of those things where it's very rare to have these sorts of conversations about how different kinds of industries influence each other. And I think that was around the time I had a style savvy fanaticism that I loved. That was also around the time that I think Louis Vuitton hired Lightning from Final Fantasy 13 to do modeling. And it was just interesting to start to see all these weird cross-industry influences and how that was beginning to shape the future of games. And so I think we're going to see a little bit of those things coming back here and thinking about how is it that not games as an industry is its own insulated medium and also own insulated industry, but rather how it's been connected to other forms of art and industry from conception to now, and how we can be thinking about the future of games and the future of making them and thinking about them by kind of revisiting old comparisons, particularly with film. So I'm going to stop there because I already know that a great talk is on the way. So please, everyone, join me in welcoming Gita Jackson.
Hello, I'm Gita. Up until last week, I was a staff writer at Motherboard, which is Vice's technology site. I was let go on Thursday, so now I just think about things professionally. But this is pretty much what I knew about media going into it. My mom, when she realized I was good at writing, told me something like, okay, Gita, you're an excellent writer, but what you really got to do now is learn a trade. So I never did that, and now I'm unemployed. So here I am. But I want to talk about this idea that I've been hearing off and on for the past 10-ish years when I've been involved in and working in video and just sort of ranting on the internet about video games and new media art in general. And it's something that is, on the one hand, is true on the surface and something I agree with, but on the other hand, as time goes on, I felt like we could possibly explode and explore some of the definitions and the terms and the sort of ideas that have been laid out by this idea. So this is the idea I'm not going to talk about. Games shouldn't be movies, which is something that I think is nominally true. But I think you have to get really, really specific about what it is you're talking about and why when you say that. One of the big things I always think when I see this phrase is that what I think is like, what games and what movies are you talking about? Normally, when we're talking about this phrase, we're talking about, in terms of movies, the most mainstream expression of cinema, which is the Hollywood blockbuster action film. I think of like the Spielbergian spectacular experience, which has dominated our sort of cinemas since the 1970s at this point. And I think that the comparison being made here is towards the most mainstream expression of games, on the other hand. But actually not the most mainstream expression of games, because the most mainstream expression of games actually is stuff like Madden and FIFA. Those are the games that everybody plays all the time, or Candy Crush. These are games that people don't think of as games as a part of the games culture, but they are nevertheless, they keep the industry afloat with how much money they make every single year. But other than that, the other biggest, most interesting games are sort of, Uncharted. Think of a game that is a game that wants to be a movie in some way, or allow you to experience something cinema-like through playing it. And it is a game that I think is beloved, but has been sort of the Naughty Dog approach to developing a narrative and portraying a narrative in video games has been, I think, rightly critiqued for mimicking very, very closely the narrative style of mainstream Hollywood movies. So yeah, I mean, I guess I do agree with this on the surface. But I also, I think from different vantage points, where you have a different understanding of what a video game is and what a movie or time-based media or new media art is. You have the lines between these two things actually become really, really blurred, which I will continue to discuss in the rest of this talk. But I think the way that I have to get into there is to answer this other question. Maddie talked a little bit about how we met, but I have to talk about how I got into video games, which is something that people ask me a lot. And there are two equally true stories about how this happened for me. The first story is the personal narrative, which I think that a lot of people have when they are asked about why they want to get into the industry of making video games or writing about video games or talking about video games. And I grew up, for me, my dad works in IT, and he's always been a bit of an autodidact, so he would buy these game consoles for the kids, but also as a way to give himself a fun technology tool. Like one year he bought himself a TV for Christmas, and my mom got very mad at him, but he wanted to see what the new TV was like. But I, through there, my older brother started playing many genre classics, like Metal Gear Solid 2 was something that I watched over his shoulder as if it was episodes of a television show every day when we came home from school. And I ended up taking his PlayStation 2 with me to college with his copy of Shadow of the Colossus 2. So if you're looking for that, I have it. I'm so sorry. That is, I have a passion for this form. I have been playing games for a very, very long time. I have the light guns from Duck Hunt somewhere in my basement still. When I went home to see my brother most recently, we found his copy of the Orange Box. I know all these cultural signifiers, and that's why. It's because it's always been a part of my life. But there's also this other narrative that I think explains why I'm so intellectually engaged with this form and obsessed with it still, which is when I was in my senior year of college, so 2011 to 2012, which was 10 years ago now, I was in a cinema degree, and that was where, at Oberlin College, which had a teeny tiny little cinema studies department, that was where I began exploring avant-garde experimental cinema. And the exploration of these topics, especially through experimental animation and, sort of the intersection of the kinds of people that end up making infomercials for Adult Swim, if you know what I mean, and the broader art world, I ended up getting introduced to the works of Cory Arcangel. So this is Cory Arcangel's most famous piece. He had, in 2011, a solo show at the Whitney, which I think he is still the youngest artist to have a solo show at the Whitney. I think after his show, they were like, you're the youngest one, we're not doing that again. I remember when I saw it, it was just so incredibly loud, which in the old Whitney building was very funny. There's these concrete stairs, and you'd walk up them, and just reverberating through the stairs, he had hacked a bunch of cartridges for bowling games and made them self-playing so that they would only bowl gutter balls. So it was just the loudest cacophonous crashes, and all these old people that have no idea what he's doing are just like, okay. But Super Mario Clouds is really easy to figure out. This is, I'm sure you all recognize this. That's 1-1, and those taken everything out except for the clouds. I've seen this installed in a couple of different ways. This is how it was installed in the Whitney when I saw it. It's originated in 2002. That's a video. I don't know if the video will work, but the video will show you what it is actually like in action, if I can get it to happen. There we go. So that's what the whole installation would look like. I've seen it also, this installed with basically It's on 3 walls of a room, and you step into the small room floor to ceiling, and it's just Super Mario clouds. It's a really calming piece to stand and look at. The blue is so vibrant, especially in the sort of the version where it's encompassing the whole room, is really quite lovely. So the other very funny piece from this show, actually, I really liked was there's what's it called? There's Always One at Every Party, which was a video piece that cut together all of the times on Seinfeld when Kramer talks about his coffee table book about coffee tables, essentially creating a whole new episode of Seinfeld, which is amazing. And around this same time, when I was thinking about video games in this way, seeing them at the Whitney, right? Like, this wasn't the only video game piece in this Cory Archangel solo show, the entire top floor of the Whitney. This was also shown, I think, a recent retrospective also at the Whitney. You know, this is the most Super Mario that's been shown at an art gallery other than the permanent collection of the MoMA, where I was finding in my pitching that around this time when I met Maddie Myers, and she's one of my close friends, and she was at Paste Games at the time, and I started sort of pitching writing because I really could use $50 after I graduated from school. And I was finding that when I talked to people that existed in video games, they had not really ever heard of this, and they didn't really care about it when they did. And I found that very, very confusing. Of course, at this time, I'm right out of Oberlin, so I'm not talking to the right people, right? I'm in a very hot apartment in Chicago, melting on the floor. But it was interesting to see the sort of disconnect between this one space that is treating games as like materials that could be made and shown as fine art, and this other part of games which was, in my experience at the time, really struggling to find critical language in order to describe themselves, and struggling with some concepts that I feel like other forms of art have really, and sort of conversations that they really kind of had already, especially regarding representation, which I feel like we're on year 400 of the representation conversation. But let me get out of this thing. Oh my God, you were so right, Maddie, about losing my mouse in front of everybody. There we go. Sick. But yeah, I mean, around that same time, in 2011, when I was still at school, I started reading Kotaku, where I would end up working later at my career. Specifically, I remember so distinctly an article that was an interview with Davey Wreden about the Stanley Parable. And this is a picture of the original modded Half-Life version of the Stanley Parable, which that's how that game began life. It's kind of funny to be here 10 years after it came out and thinking about how it is a new game again in a lot of ways. Because when I was learning about it and when I was reading about the people that worked on it, specifically Wreden, who really put himself out there at the time through the press, and also I think this is how press operates. They look for the most important person to talk to, and then all the quotes get assigned to that person, but they may just be the only person that's answering emails, and there's not a lot we can do to control how that shakes out, unfortunately. But Wreden sort of put himself out there as like a person who made this game by himself, at least in the mod stage. I read something, I was doing a little historical reading, and he said apparently to Vice that he found the experience of solo dev work excruciating, which it absolutely sounds like it. But so if you don't know what the Stanley Parable is, basically in the Stanley Parable is a game which your actions are narrated by an omniscient narrator. But as a player, you have a choice to follow this narration or not. And you can sort of act against the narrator. If the first choice, this is a famous scene from the game, he says that you go left, and I literally, every time I played this, gone the opposite direction. I just can't help myself. Someday I'll know what happens if you continue to do what he says. I played this game, but this interview really struck a chord with me. So at the time, this Wreden was 22, living in Los Angeles, and said his only game dev experience was a workshop he took at USC. And this is something that Wreden had to say about it. So part of what I'm trying to say with the Stanley Parable is that the distinction between game and non-game is all in your head. the best parts of the game are the parts that the player arrives at themselves without me saying anything. If someone plays the game and they say, wow, I really enjoyed that, then maybe they have to reconsider what's valid fun in a game. Reedon also went on to say, ran out of room here, if you decide for yourself that you enjoyed it and that decision conflicts with a previous belief, now that's interesting to me. I realize that this can come off sounding kind of zen and artsy, end quote. To me, these were the conversations about games that I was really interested in having, and it filled me immediately with a strong desire to work at Gawker, which, there we go, I did that. And it felt so exciting because in my process of working in new media art in college and learning about avant-garde experimental cinema, I was already engaging in games in this way. Unfortunately, I struggle to think about now times in which I've seen developers. I mean, you don't see very many indie developers get interviews like this on any major media site anymore at all, which is sad. But I also struggle to think of interviews with developers in AAA, in indie games, wherever, where I feel like you're engaging on something with your own work as an art object that imparts meaning. And so much of this interview was about what does it mean, and Reedon sort of refusing to really give a straightforward answer to that and say, I was trying, I was experimenting with, et cetera, a fun critical pushback, between critic and artist. I think generally when people say things like, what a game should not be movies, the question that they're actually asking themselves and to other people is, like, what is a game and what is a movie? In terms of games, I mean, we can define these in really facile ways. Like saying a game, I've heard so many definitions of games anymore. I just feel like it truly is, you know it when you see it, essentially. It's the same as pornography. And then what is a movie? Well, we have a more expanded definition of this, generally accepted, something shot on film or video. A movie specifically brings to mind narrative cinema, although there is a lot of non-narrative and experimental cinema. When I was in school, the things that I was watching and really engaging with were stuff like Stan Brakhage, who is the famous video artist who uses painted on the film strip itself and would run those through film projectors. His last film, all of this comes with a level of artish, prestige, rumordom. But his last film was like him with his hair in blood and spit, just kind of smearing things across a film strip while he was on his deathbed. I think his most famous work, though, is Window Water Baby Moving, which my professor showed to us in class, which is an experimental art piece of one of his children being born, which was really moving. So, those are not kinds of movies that one would see if you're going to a theater. They're often, occupy different kinds of artistic spaces, usually art galleries, although there are some, when I was studying these things, intending to be a curator, which didn't really happen, there is a lot of conversation about what is the best way to show video art, experimental video. I will actually come back to that later, but they're interesting conversations that I think are neat. So if we understand, though, that the definitions of these things are not really set, then what does it mean when you say something, this X should not be Y, If X and Y have really mutable definitions, as seen in the broad culture of these things, one of the movies that really made an impact on me when I was in school was this movie called Blue, which is about, comes from the AIDS crisis. I unfortunately just forgot the artist's name, but it is a movie of this artist narrating over an entirely blue screen just the experience of living in the age of AIDS in New York. And it is deeply moving. It's longer, but much more like hypnotic than you really think it is. And a lot of people, I think, if you told them about that, would say that is not a movie, but it is a movie. That is cinema in some way. That is encompassed within the culture of movies. But when we try to make a distinction between these two forms, often what people have to say is something about interactivity. And I'm about to blow your freaking minds. guess what? Literally all art is interactive. When you stand in front of a painting in a gallery, the most stereotypical idea of what it means to interact with art at all. If you stand in a painting in a gallery, you are bringing your entire human history to that painting and trying to derive meaning from it from an artist that is not standing there with you. You are having a conversation with that art. You're talking to it. You're interacting with it. You know, if you go to a gallery and look at a Jackson Pollock or a Rothko, no two people are going to have the same emotional experience looking at those pieces of art. When I was in Chicago, I had a chance to see some Rothkos, which are fantastic. I was so mean about Rothko until I actually stood in front of a Rothko. What you don't understand when you're just looking at it is these paintings are massive. They are absolutely giant. And then the gradients of color, it's so delicate and so precise, so moving to feel like you can just fall into this deep fields of red and blue and yellow. It's a lovely experience. But when I look at that, the only way that means something to me is if I bring something to it. If I impart something to this panel, you know, the historical backgrounds can sometimes help you meet a piece of art in the middle. But in general, you know, I feel like this is to me, this is a really obvious example of interactivity. But if that doesn't work for you, I think the best experience I've had interacting with art recently was going to see the movie Goodfellas at Film Forum. I've seen that movie dozens of times because it completely rules. I love every second of it. Good old Marty. But seeing it at Film Forum was a completely new and different experience that made me think about the movie in wildly different ways. One of the big parts of that was because I was sitting next to other people and I was hearing them react to things. And so when we all collectively gasp or laugh or clap for somebody, I felt not just connected to the people around me, but I felt like the movie was like dancing with me. It's dorky to describe it that way, but I did feel like this movie and this space and this group of people had all been joined for a moment to learn something new here about this story of these people who wanted to be gangsters. It's just such a beautiful looking movie, and especially when you see it projected in a beautiful, beautiful print. He's truly a master. But there's also a couple examples of installation art that I wanted to show in terms of art that's more typically interactive in a way that's, I think, more tangible. Let's see. So this is Untitled, a Portrait of Ross in LA by Felix Gonzalez Torres. Ross Laycock, Portrait of Ross in LA, was Gonzalez Torres' partner, and he passed away from AIDS. So you probably have heard about this or seen it on the internet. It's very famous. The pile of candy here is equal to Laycock's weight when he was at his ideal weight. And throughout the day, patrons of the museum are encouraged to take candy from this pile so that over the day you watch it sort of fade away and disappear. I have seen it a couple times. I've never taken a piece of candy because I feel very emotionally charged, you know, thinking about contributing to this and thinking about what these symbols all mean together, thinking about what does it mean that this is a portrait of someone that the artist has lost. You know, taking something from this is like very literally interactive in that you are allowed to touch it, which you are not allowed to do for most pieces of art in a museum. But also you can see the act of interacting, prompting the audience member to go there, really enhances and reinforces the meaning. I have another pop-up for freaking internet, and I'm just going to assume that I don't need all the things. But also all public art is interactive art. This is, let's see, what's his name? Chris Burden's City Light. I'm going to talk about Burden again later, interestingly enough. So this is at LACMA. This is over by where my partner David's parents live, and we've been there a couple of times. And I love being around this. I love walking in and around this. I know it's a tacky Instagram trap, but there is something so nice, especially in a city that is so inhospitable to public meeting places like Los Angeles. To go there, and like people are taking quinceañera photos, and tourists have just dropped off there. Everyone's excited to be there. Everyone's thinking about the ways that our city is illuminated and coming together in that light. And you wouldn't be able to experience that if you couldn't publicly wander through it and interact with these things that you might have seen on the street every day in whole new recontextualized forms. Let's see. But here's what I would really excited to talk about in terms of art that is interactive, art that asks people to interact with it. Performance art, which I love, and I always wish that I could see more performance art, but I'm going to talk just about 3 really, really famous examples that you probably already know about, but I still think they're really interesting to think about in context of, like, what does it mean to ask someone to interact with something? So first of all, let's talk about Cut Piece by Yoko Ono, who you may have heard of. Yoko Ono's Cut Piece is, I think, her most famous work. It is the work where she would sit on the floor of a stage or a gallery floor and place a pair of scissors in front of her, and then audience members were instructed to cut a piece of her clothing away and keep it. And so for me, she just doesn't talk, she just sits there and is vibing while people remove clothing from her body. So for me, like, what's interesting about this is how much boldness, I guess, it takes to be the person that starts cutting, and then how much choice you have in terms of where you cut and what you cut. I was reading a little bit of the documentation from the time, and some people would cut bashfully, and some other people would brazenly go for the front of her dress or her bra strap. So you learn a lot about yourself through this really simple act, especially in a space that is so weird, and also where it feels so illicit, like you're disrobing someone. Again, really literally interactive, but by giving someone a really, really simple and open-ended prompt for action, you can lead them into really interesting areas of thought. And then another one, you've almost definitely heard of this one. Jay-Z's favorite, Marina Abramovic. The artist is present now. Last I heard of Marina Abramovic, she was doing like Instagram influencer style $5,000 like cruises or whatever, which I bet it pays a lot better than art is what I'll say. Like, go you. But this was a piece that did mean a lot to people. There's a reason why it's so famous. So this is a famous piece called The Artist is Present. Marina Abramovic is in white here. She sits in it. It consists of a room and 2 chairs, sometimes a table, and she sits in the chair and she does not speak. She just stares across from audience member volunteers. And many people were deeply, deeply moved by this. Her whole thing is the idea of thinking about the body as a canvas and the body as the form of the art, and thinking about how you can get people to be emotionally moved just by your presence, which people reported bursting into tears, weeping. It made such an impression on Jay-Z that he put her in a very bad music video. But the last piece that I think is important to think about here is another of Chris Burden's piece, and this is called Shoot. So Shoot was a performance that was staged once in 1971, where Burden arranged for a friend to come by and shoot him. So this piece was documented by a photographer and a videographer, and that's how it's exhibited now, essentially, is through the remaining video and the photos that are left, because he was shot. This is the performance. He got shot by his friend. Burden said at the time that it was inspired by the sort of overwhelming presence of the Vietnam War at the time, and also the presence of violence in American society, which is such that one is always hearing about gun violence, but you may have no actual idea what it feels like to be shot. So that led him to this moment. It is an incredibly influential and famous piece. It also played some part, it's like not entirely clear, in Chris Burden leaving his teaching post at UCLA. Another artist, John John Dutch, I think is his name, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, was his student and did a version of Shoot where he played Russian roulette with what appeared to be a loaded pistol in his classroom. And at that point, Chris Burden was like, I kind of can't be here anymore. Goodbye. I don't blame you. But let's see, what does my next slide say? What I think is interesting to bring up about these is that there are a lot of conversations that are happening in video games that have happened already and have had significant, really interesting art pieces come out of those conversations in other forms and other medias. The idea of what is interactivity, what makes something interactive or not, what is the role of interactivity in art is, it's so exciting to some people that they watched a friend and colleague that they respected get shot by his friend. You know, like this is the links that people go to bodily and physically to understand these artistic questions. And video games could be a part of this, like immediately, because there's so many examples in our own history of games that are asking these questions too. Like the Stanley Parable also is a weird form of performance art in some way, and that you are performing for the game every time you play it, that it offers you a script and you can choose to follow it or not follow it. It's just very fun to think about that game that way. So I don't want to be purely a hater, because I do know that there are spaces where these conversations are happening. Like this space at NYU Game Center is full of really smart young people that love to talk about video games. And I also wanted to think about Indiepocalypse is a game zine that comes with a sampler of 15 little game projects with it, which I think is someone's got to be out here doing that shit, personally. There's still something, when I was 10 years ago, a lot more people were casually blogging about things. You got a lot of different perspectives, and there still are people blogging, and there's much more diversity in terms of the professional games press than there used to be. But there isn't that sense of there being a culture of video games that encompasses both the commercial side of this art as practice and the side that is non-commercial or just purely devoted to art as practice, where that used to feel like maybe there was some blending in there, as much as there are issues with the movie indie game, the movie. That is an example of a time when we were very interested culturally in the people who made these things as artists, how they would speak about their own work as artists. And maybe that idea is imperfect, but when I was getting into video games, I did not see any difference between being a solo dev and games as an individual art practice. And to me, I still think they're the same thing. You still are interrogating your work in the same way. I think small teams are pretty much the same, honestly. Like, indie games is full of just weird, cool art that's aggressive and fascinating and intimate and made by so many different kinds of people. But it's different, And like when it comes to like writing criticism professionally, I mean, like Vice laid me off last week, so I pretty much know exactly how much that shit is valued. It's not very much. There's been very little growth in terms of creating spaces where we can interpret games both as commercial products and also as stories and experiences that impart meaning to people. So the other question I think that people are asking when they try to ask what is a game and what is a movie, and therefore have been saying games should not be movies, is just what does it mean to make art? And I'm literally not going to sell this for you. Sorry if you thought I was going to, but people have been asking this question for hundreds and hundreds of years, and I'm only 33. I don't know anything. So let's see. It's I have to take this back to the Stanley Parable to sort of explain what I'm thinking here. So to me, based on my own background, the only way to really understand the Stanley Parable is as a piece of art rather than a consumer product. It's deliberately adversarial towards the player, really driving them to think more critically by interacting with it. The more you don't do what the narrator says, the more it pushes back on against you. And it's fascinating to play even now because I still feel like the game is a living engine. It's like a living thing rather than allowing for a diverse set of experiences that have been predetermined long before I came near it. It feels to me when I'm interacting with it, when I'm performing towards the Stanley Parable, that it has more in common with something like Cut Piece than it does with a lot of other kinds of video games, in which I am being asked to do something that is, I'm being given the opportunity to do something that is transgressive, and then to deal with how I feel about that, like on my own time, inside my own brain. I think that there's a couple other artists I wanted to mention, and I feel like approach these same kinds of ways of making art through their video games. Bennett Foddy, especially Getting Over It, is definitely one of those pieces where that is just like a meditation on failure. That's clearly what the whole game is about, to me at least, where it's about failing over and over and over and over, and then when you finally win, you get to tell Bennett how you feel about failing, which is a very cute little joke, I think. Like QWOP is also similar in that this is like so clearly a theme that someone goes back to over and over and over again to explore in different kinds of ways. I also think our friend Christine Love, she makes really incredible, very character-driven and narrative-driven visual novels that blew my mind like when I first played them, and then she ended up being the nicest person, so that's also great. But let's see, they're also full of these little jokes about how much the game is alive, how much you want the game to be alive, where in Hate Plus, one of the visual novels she made, there is an achievement you can only get if you bake a character a birthday cake. And you have to send a picture of that cake to Christine in order to get the achievement unlocked on Steam. She wants to know, and there's a part in the game's narrative where the game stops and is like, you're gonna make a cake now. And you can't stop this process. The game assumes you're making that cake, and gives you 45 minutes of alone time, basically, to bake a cake. And I really like that too. Like it's prompting you to get up and go do something that has absolutely no bearing on the game at all, but is important somehow to achieving completion of this game. I also think her work deals with sex and sexuality in a way that's like 1,000 times more interesting and mature than like most video games that exist. Where Lady Killer in a Bind is definitely like lesbian BDSM porn, but it also has something really specific to say about being queer, having sex, and like power and submission. It's fantastic. On that similar vein, Robert Yang's work about, I had some pictures, sorry. So this is Bennett Foddy Getting Over It. I'm sure you've seen that game. And then this is from Hate Plus, the Christine Love. I didn't put a picture of Robert Yang's work, which is all these sort of really intimate micro-experiences that gamify certain aspects of being a gay man. I think the Cobra Club is the one. It's a dick pic simulator. Yeah, I didn't put a piece up there because I just didn't really want to stand next to a CGI dick, but it is really, really good work, and I think it's fantastic. He's an incredibly intelligent person. But it also, I think, forces you to interact. It forces you to assume the role of a gay man with absolutely no prompting or introduction or equivocating towards heteronormativity, which is just a very intense space to walk into, and the expectation it gives you is really exciting for me, because there's so few spaces in the world where you are fully assumed to have complete knowledge of the experience of being queer and are pushed away from if you're not willing to meet the game on its own terms. But I don't want to talk about too many AAA games because they're not very exciting to me in this way, but I think Remedy's Control also approaches the same level of like sort of literary complexity or sort of approach to meaning and story in a way that shies away from the most obvious. It just feels like it's a game made by people that do things other than just play video games, which is so refreshing when you're playing one of these. And it does some interesting thing with mixed media. I think there's a moments in the game that really stuck with me where you are walking through what is supposed to be the frames of a projected video. So a silhouette of a character, but then and it's like a film that is being overlaid. It's a very interesting effect, and it makes you feel like you're walking through the frames of a movie as it's being projected outward. And there's something about that visual effect, that kind of abstraction, the acknowledgement of the similarity between these two narrative forms that feels really deliberate and really interesting, like an experiment that's not quite finished, but one that I'm excited to see where it goes. But I think what I'm trying to articulate here is that these games, like the best movies and paintings and staging and performance art that I've seen, I feel like they're primarily intended to impart meaning rather than to be concerned with being a commercial object. They do it in many different ways from each other, but that is what brings them all together for me. And it's just simply nice. They have something to say. And the thing that they have to say also, I think that's important to point out, is not exclusively derived from the narrative, the story that they're telling. It's about the experience that you have sitting here, bringing yourself to this piece of art and meeting it in the middle, letting it dance and have a conversation with you. Let's see. I want to end on a note of openness here. My slide have gotten completely fucked up, so unfortunately, you're gonna see these things out of order, but it's fine. Here, we'll stand here. Actually, I can't, or else I'm not gonna be able to see my speaker notes. So, a large part of the idea behind the statement, games shouldn't be movies, also has to do with the way that games are seen as a lesser art form. I'm pretty sure everyone in this room already knows that games are art. It's like a very dumb and annoying conversation to have. But sometimes I get this feeling, especially when I'm interacting with people outside spaces like this, that a lot of people who are very, very into video games or want to go into the industry of making video games or writing about video games, they don't have a strong understanding about how art is made in other contexts and how art is discussed in other contexts. Only truly have an understanding of as an art as market tool, or art as merchandising, or art as IP. So I don't want to disparage Reedon's future choices after the Stanley Parable came out 10 years ago, but it's since, it was a game that launched on Steam, got a lot of great reviews, and it's extremely successful. And now it has had its updated re-release, the Stanley Parable Deluxe Edition, and it is interesting to look at the differences between how that game is presented now and how that game was presented 10 years ago, especially to read quotes like this one. This, you have to remember, he said this to Vice 10 years ago and was 22 at the time. So my mom's an academic. I think academics are fine. But this was the second part of the quote. I'm just going to have to read the first part. But this is how he talked to Vice about his game in 2011. Because I don't have the freaking quote. It's fine, though. Here's what I'm going to do. See, it loads behind. I was trying to be freaking slick, but I didn't work it out. Let's see. I've got to end this presentation. It's the whole thing. But I don't want to do it. So the gag is you're never going to know what these quotes said. But basically, the first quote was about the game as an object to try to impart meaning, where he wanted to make players ask themselves questions about how narrative works within a game, to see within himself how far he could push a narrative conceit and how much you can get a player to go along with it, even if at the end of the day, these parameters don't exist. This is a scenario that exists only when I turn this machine on, and there are certain things I can do and not be able to do within it. Clearly, the Stanley Parable is an extremely successful experiment in narrative, in that it is now, once again, it's now a cross-platform launch. It's on my PS5. David got to play it and finally see it, but it's been repackaged not so much as an experiment narrative, but a humor game. And it is an extremely funny game. The sort of stuffy British narrator thing, it freaking always gets me. I don't know what it is, but I really do get got every time by that game. But if you look at the new stuff they added in, even though they poke fun at themselves, You enter this entire room that's about the Stanley Parable 2. And at a certain point, there's sorry for the spoilers, but you get like a non-standard game over, and the game reloads, and it's just the same menu screen, but it says 2 at the end, which is a great gag. There's a lot of really good and funny referential humor in terms of the motions of AAA video games and how they try to differentiate sequels from these originals and reinvent games and experimental concepts that don't need to be reinvented. But they don't have any more. There's no more water in the well of how are we going to problematize narrative within these first-person video games. There's just nothing there. They did it already. They did it already 10 years ago. It makes me think about, like, what if Chris, I mean, he's passed away, but, like, what if Chris Burton re-released Shoot 2? What would that even look like? That would be bizarre. We don't think about art in the same way as we think about commercial products. It is great that there's all this new content in the Stanley Parable Deluxe version, but is that the same Stanley Parable that I played on my like freaking white MacBook that I had in college 10 years ago? Is that the same, Stanley Parable that is asking people to consider how narrative works in their in video games at all, to think about it at all while you're playing a game, think about what it means that you have someone telling you what to do, what your freedom is allowed for, But it's still very good because, it's still a very, very, very good video game. But it is a little bit different. It's just a little bit different from what made me fall in love with it way back in the day. So some of the things I talked about tonight are all about how art is contextualized within culture as well. So when I was in college, we talked a little bit about exhibiting, video art in the context of a black box, like a movie theater, or a white room, like an art gallery. And there's some art that does a lot better in either things. Goodfellas is not going to work in the white box context. That is a movie, a narrative space. You want to be in a dark, dark, dark room and to feel like the entire other rest of the world has gone away so you can disappear into the world of the film. But there's a lot of art, video art, that is too unusually short, unusually long, or has other kinds of exhibition issues that make it difficult to show that kind of video art in a movie theater. I'm thinking of stuff like, what's it called? 24-Hour Psycho by Douglas Gordon, where he slowed down Psycho so that it would play once over a 24-hour period. You are not going to be able to go to a theater and watch that for 24 hours. It just simply wouldn't make sense. It's the kind of thing you see in a gallery to go and sort of wander through, look at it, think about it, decide you've had enough, move on. So what if instead, instead of saying declaratively the games are one thing or another, we thought more about the cultural context in which they are given to us and what that says about not just sort of the material ways in they're being made, but how that allows us to derive meaning from them. So how is a game that launches on itch.io different from one that launches on Steam? What context are we supposed to be thinking about those two games in? Or sort of what is a game that's announced at E3? How is that different from one that is exhibited at the Whitney? Or how is it different to make something with a team of one person as a solo artistic practice rather than with a team of multiple different people? What is like a team of one person versus like a team of thousands of people that are all crunching religiously to try to bring someone else's vision over to the finish line? How are all of these things creating a context in which these games are presented to us as art or not, or something in between? There's a lot that we can actually learn about this from other forms of art. So games and movies tell stories in radically different ways. Of course, on the one hand, there's like a 90 minutes versus like 60 plus hours of spending time with a narrative, which is a ridiculous and sometimes numbing way to experience a narrative story. just because there's so many things that will happen because it's so freaking long. But time-based media, but they're both like time-based media, and they rely on the moving image in order to impart meaning to people. So what conversations have people who work in cinema and people who appreciate art as cinema as art, what conversations have they already have that we can just sort of glean some knowledge from that and apply it to video games? There's definitely knowledge of that in there. So, there's also like material concerns that we could really learn from Hollywood. I mean, largely, like Hollywood is a unionized industry. It's not perfect, and there are issues in that. I know the ISPCA is still looking forward some better contracts. I'm not sure how that got resolved, but it's rough to be working on sets. But it is one, and video games simply is not one. And Hollywood has also like extremely lapped video games on issues of representation, even though Hollywood doesn't do a really good job of representation at all. But I was able to see The Woman King in a theater, and it was the #1 movie in the country for at least one weekend. And that is a movie that's like, it's a good action movie, basically. Viola Davis just beats the shit out of people. It's like pretty fucking sick. Flips them over her. It's amazing. But, that's a movie that the principal cast is made up entirely of Black women. And I cannot think of a single video game that is made up entirely of Black women in its cast. It's just a little sad. So outside of Hollywood, also, the culture of cinema as it exists, while it's harder than it used to be, it does take pride in valuing and financing outsider art. So I'm thinking about stuff like George Lucas's appreciation of the works of Arthur Lipset. Arthur Lipset was a Canadian video artist who used mostly found footage art to sort of create these rapidly moving hypnotic portraits of city life. He was a huge, huge influence on George Lucas. George Lucas was he also, I was told once, like just keeps and preserves avant-garde cinema and regularly lends out his collection to colleges. The George Lucas Museum of the Moving Images and concerns a lot of the stuff he's kept that are really significant pieces of art that he's just kept in pristine condition. So, people like George Lucas, and then people also like Martin Scorsese has a World Cinema Project. But then also people like Vera Drew, who made The People's Joker. So The People's Joker had one screening at TIFF before she got a cease and desist from Warner Brothers, but it is a sort of parody film about the Joker from Batman, but retold as a trans narrative. And while I did see some people being like, well, what did you think was going to happen when she unfortunately was no longer able to show her movie at TIFF? I did also see the critics who saw this film were really excited about it. And they were really happy about this sort of weird little piece of outsider art that is, using other people's IP to tell an interesting story about what it is like to live in the world and be a person. It isn't not about money, because if you're screening at TIFF, then you're probably looking for a distributor deal and some good reviews and a little bit of buzz. It doesn't hoit. But it is not assumed by the culture that all movies are made for the same audiences and in the same context. If you're making a parody Joker movie about the trans experience, you are probably not making a consumer product. You're making something that's really personal. You're making something that means something to you and is trying to make other people feel things. Games may not be movies, but these are some things that I hope that games can learn from movies and other forms of art. And at the very least, I hope games can expand again to encompass people that make personal, weird, semi-illegal pieces of art. Leanne.
Well, thank you. Next, we're going to transition over into Q&A. So let's come over here. Cool. Yeah, we have like all the different commands here, and I do it with my brain. Cool. So thank you for that talk.
No problem.
That was amazing.
Thank you.
I do want everyone to be thinking about questions and things, and we'll get to you all. But I think one of the interesting things that you left off on there is a phrase I actually don't hear used in games, outsider art.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I actually just realized we don't use that phrase in this industry.
But to me, like when I look at it, it's like 90% of the things on itch.io are outsider art. They are little experiments, people made by people with zero power that the industry can give them. People who are truly like off in their own world. I mean, what's the consumer soft products, that game from that studio, Cruelty Squad, is like a primo example of outsider art to me, in a way where it feels really connected to I'm thinking sort of like the Gen X sort of negativity culture, like OK Cola kind of stuff,
right?
And deeply referential, but it's weird to see it contextualized then within the world of video games, right?
Right.
Because if we put that game in context with a lot of the other things that it is talking about, Cruelty Squad is this really like wild parody of shooters. It's very similar in tone, I think, to the Stanley Parable and games that were like the Stanley Parable when it came out. But it is a shooter, and it plays like a shooter. If you played Doom, you'd probably be good at this game. I haven't played Doom, so I'm terrible at this game. But it is also just difficult to look at. Like hard, hurts my eyes, bright lime green color scheme, aggressively anti-player and aggressively anti-capitalism, just really making it clear to you that, like, as a soldier, you are a tool of the state and you are imminently replaceable, down to just body parts that will slowly replace you by pieces, if that's what it takes. And it is, to me, better understood in the context of, like, trauma films, Trauma films are deeply problematic. I would definitely read Wikipedia summaries if you decide to watch any of them, because 99 of them are like really, really great. And then there's a horrible transphobic joke like right at the end. It's just like, come on, like, can we just erase that part of the 90s, please? Right. Yeah, I'm over it. But trauma is where like James Gunn comes from, and like here you see again where it's like someone like James Gunn can go from writing Romeo and Juliet. These truly outsider art, gross out movies. This is the studio that brought us Toxic Avenger, which is one of the grossest movies I've ever seen. Just so much fake snot, grime. Ugh, I hate it. If you can go from that to being a freaking Disney guy, where are the pathways, though, for people that make art and want to continue to make art with a unique and interesting voice? Where are the pathways towards not just like sort of economic freedom, but also being appreciated by a circle of your peers and by people who want to see your specific and unique skills being brought into and onto bigger and bigger projects? It feels like I know a lot of people that have made indie games and then made one or two things, then never made anything again, and because they didn't want to start working at a AAA game dev place. And it's absolutely impossible to predict what will become a successful game on Steam or itch.
Yeah, I think, and also what I thought was kind of interesting was when you made that comparison of like what belongs in the black box and the white box, and itch's page is white and Steam is kind of black. I thought that was kind of, I don't know if that's a correlation.
I completely wasn't thinking about that, because I also have customized my itch.io like background, so it's like a looping GIF from Sailor Moon.
So I was kind of thinking about, so you come from this perspective as a culture writer, and you've been through kind of in a way in which the sort of journalist and media landscape that we started our careers in was simultaneously with social media. There was no such thing as like writing in this space without participating in social media discourse. And so I'm kind of curious to hear from you, like, what are the stakes here about a non-explicit or non-supported spaces for, let's say, games as art, and I kind of very specifically say this as sort of like games that are not forced to be commercial products.
Yeah.
Which I find like one critique or one like thing that we used to grumble about, back in the day was we kind of feel forced to be on this sort of hamster wheel of the hype cycle.
Yep.
Whereas like you can't find writing about, or you don't find outlets who support writing that doesn't exist in a very specific space, no matter how much it could interest other people.
Yeah.
So like, what is at stake for like our industry not specifically having a space that like wants to support non-commercial things like explicitly?
There are some spaces, and they are few and far between. And in my experiences of being to video game oriented galleries, sometimes there is a curatorial approach that reminds me of the time when, every 6 months or so you'd see an article, op-ed in some local newspaper that went bam, biff, pow, comic books aren't for kids anymore, where I feel like I'm walking into a space that feels like the ice cream museum, the Instagram zone, where I'm supposed to be I'm not looking at art that's being contextualized. I'm looking at a space that has branded itself as something. That's not true of all spaces, but I think what is immediately clear is that as much as there is a scene that exists on the internet, there is not then an equally tangible space that exists offline, where if you want to go and talk to people about movies, when I went to see RRR at Film Forum, was that Film Forum? Or no, that was the IFC Center. A bunch of people who freaking love movies just started striking up a conversation with me, and talking to me about the film we had just seen. There is a certain level of appreciation where that's like welcome in that space, and also everyone's here to have the same kind of conversation. Where it's always like difficult to talk to people about video games because there is no sort of on-ramping infrastructure that helps people understand that people are interested in this as a culture, as a scene, where I feel like, especially when I meet any other women or femmes, we're always having this conversation that's like, which of us knows more about video games? Which one of us is introducing the other to video games? And it's deeply uncomfortable, and I feel like it just leads to us in the scene having on the internet, especially because we are locked into a hype cycle, we're locked into a discourse cycle, the same arguments like every 6 to 9 months or so. And I watch as over and over again repeat the same discourses that I feel like, again, these are things that are not settled but have been discussed in much more complex ways than other forms of art. We are not so unique as an industry or a form of art that we can't incorporate some of the knowledge these other people have into our own knowledge bases. And I feel like without the spaces with the people that can help bring you this knowledge and tie these things together, we are really sort of limiting the growth of the people out there on itch.io that have no support and desperately need a space to go to be able to talk about their games in ways that make sense to them in the context that they are making them. And also, I guess it just drives me freaking insane. This makes me not want to discuss games online very much or write about them. It makes it very easy to feel like you're not being heard when you are trying to do a little work to just discuss what it is that we're all doing here.
Absolutely. And shameless plug, we do have No Quarter coming up, which is going to be a nice art space for a conversation.
I'm excited.
For other people who want to talk about games and art. But I just want to open up for questions. Are other people having anything to ask? Yes.
Yeah, a really interesting conversation you were having earlier was the idea of like outsider art becoming really mainstream, and by, I guess, the idea of like questioning the game's relationships with the player themselves in relation to like Stanley Parable or like Undertale and such. And I think it's because of the idea that the relationship is broken because of the fact that there is an element of a third wall break integrated into the game's systems, narrative, or just mechanics as a whole. And my question is, can there still be that level of outsider art without having to enforce an idea of like a third wall break or something that can be considered like in that same kind of level? Like an example I could think of, like bad games that like inherently don't try to like break a relationship with a player, but like have this massive following and become these like really huge games and such.
Oh yeah, totally. So I think the last thing you're talking about is what I think about when I think about games that are camp. Like big rigs, truck racing, whatever that is. That's camp to a T, where it just, you keep push on the gas and just keep going, and you go through the mountain, you go through the sunset, just drive off over the cliff. I love that stuff. That I do think, yeah, like interrogating these different delineations of how outsider art are expressed within video games, it does lead to some interesting observations there. Like, I hadn't even realized that like a lot of this outsider art does deal with this idea of breaking a wall between the player themselves, or I guess agitating the player to think more about the separation between themselves and the game object. But I do think that there's other kinds of examples. I think games that are intentionally janky are absolutely outsider art. I think Crusader Kings 3 is now too good of a game to be outsider art, but Crusader Kings 2, which you just have to really settle in for like a 24-hour period just to learn what the hell you're doing. That's to me like pure outsider art. Even that's made by a much larger team. You know, Dwarf Fortress maybe is a more appropriate example because it's like a dev team of 2 people, but that's not a game where you interact with it really, really just like a game. You know, it is trying to impart meaning, but that meaning comes after hundreds and hundreds of hours of just trying to see what this thing can do, which I've done and will continue to do. That game just has so many moments where the code itself, because so much of it and the way that these tiny little figures interact with each other in the game is so random. An event will occur that you could not have predicted, and you just feel like the game is fucking with you. And it's not like you feel like you're being, that wall between yourself and the game is being called attention to. It's more like actually that wall kind of evaporates and disappears, because the nature of the spaghetti code that the game is made out of just makes things happen that feel very natural and human because they're totally random. When the game first got taverns, I would just always make taverns because I was like, I want my little guys to be happy. But they would just continuously go to the tavern and drink, and then people would just die in their own vomit, drowning. And it was just like, oh my God, this is now a horribly sad story of alcoholism.
Other questions? Yes.
About the, I'm coming to when you're talking about some underclads, and that's the thing that always fascinates me. That's like, that is the piece that I know that like break through the mainstream of art in like that uses video game as a medium, and like there seems to be like nothing after that. Like there's maybe like some that art also died like 20 years ago or something.
Yeah.
Like, have you seen anything like in the art space like that is not showing games as design, which is what's really happening at the moment?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's showing games as media, not games as like whatever that is.
I'm totally with you. It was so sad to see net art have this incredible rise and then just completely disappear. You know, I'm thinking about artists like Molly Soda, who was doing really interesting work, thinking about text messages and symbols and internet iconography and, you know, the forms of the internet like the PowerPoint, where you don't really see that kind of stuff, that kind of work that wants to aesthetically explode internet culture quite as much. And I do agree that it is strange. You know, I personally have not seen as much work in the fine arts space that explores video games. I mean, of course, there is this sort of elephant in the room here, which is that the fine arts world is obsessed with NFTs, which are like not video games, right? But they have enough crossover in the world of tech with the kinds of people that hold the purse strings for people who make games that there is interest in NFTs at some major game studios like Ubisoft. So there is this, you know, I think there are issues in the fine arts world. I don't want you to leave here and think that the fine arts world is good or better than video games, because it's just a different nightmare. But one of the issues, of course, is that the fine arts world is run by a lot of people who are tastemakers and very wealthy, and sometimes they have really bad taste. And you can also use fine art as a way to, say, hide your money in investment purchases that then go into some kind of cellar and are never seen from ever again. So this is another thing. How do you buy a Cory Archangel, right? You know, his show was called Pro Tools, and one of the major things, which I thought were incredible, just again because of how big they were and how it made me think about what I do on Photoshop. He just had Photoshop gradients, you know, like that were, you know, artist custom, you know. But I was something I would do all the time when I'm making, like, when I was making live journal icons for myself.
Yes.
Was just make different kinds of Photoshop gradients, and it really forced me looking at them, made me re-examine what I do on the computer all day. But I think that since that time, in the fine arts world, there's been a lot less interest in exhibiting and showing these pieces. One, I mean, people really did not like the Cory Archangel show. At the time, it was quite contentious. I remember logging onto Tumblr one day and seeing a picture of just some classic New York trash on the street, and the caption was, "Saw the new Cory Archangel show." And it was like people were quite hostile to it. And I think that also has had a chilling effect in terms of this work showing in the fine arts world. There's so many questions about how you would exhibit this, number one, and then how you can make money off of it, number two. That it also runs into the same kinds of consumerist and capitalist problems that you got in video games, but from an entirely different direction. You know, I think there's probably a happy medium here. I used to volunteer at my very first the gig thing I did out of school was I volunteered at a nonprofit gallery called Three Walls. And that was a kind of space that showed work that really was not meant to be sold. Like, they would have catalogs for people that were browsing, but those were not picked up, those were not used. I once had someone say, "I literally want to buy this painting," and I told the artist, and they were like, "I don't know. Like, I don't know if I want to sell this." It was scans of her brain, so I can see why she wasn't interested. Yeah. But yeah, you know, I think that with the encouragement of the passionate people that are within the video game space, I think we could make this happen. I think the big part of it is just going to have to be being really annoying about it. So,
yeah, I think something that has always been very interesting to me is how much curating and exhibiting video games or just games in general is incredibly difficult, hard, and almost unsolved in a way that like for instance, I always like to say there's a reason why the majority of game exhibition is basically just the arcade just replicated. And that really favors very particular kind of game experiences that can fit into an arcade experience, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of interesting to be thinking about how much, I think this is maybe going to be relevant for people in this room, how little formal experimentation there has been with games. Like, there's already been a decision, especially in like kind of exhibit world, of what a game looks like in the art world.
You know, I'd love to see an installation of a game that was set up like a living room, at least, you know, or at least expanding the kinds of stereotypical video game experiences that one has to other kinds of people's experiences, right? Like, when I was growing up, there weren't any fucking arcades, you know? There was at best, like, Mortal Kombat at the Pizza Hut, you know?
Yeah.
Like, that was my experience with video games in that context. And this is like another really good example of how the way that these games are contextualized really determines what kinds of meaning we're going to be able to derive from it. You know, it's really similar to the sort of black box, white room debate, where if you put something in an arcade cabinet, people assume it's something you can walk up to and walk away from. You know, I think long ago at GDC, they always had those parties that everybody was so excited about going to. But the one thing I really, really liked was the chill room at one of their parties had Proteus. And Proteus is like a walking simulator. It's fantastic. If you pick up Proteus today, I promise you'll have like a beautiful, beautiful time with it. When I was the most broke and depressed, I would just turn on Proteus. It's a walking simulator, and you just walk in this like incredibly beautiful world. There's probably dozens of games like this already, but this was one of the first ones where it just like gave you nothing except go forward. There's nothing but WASD, you know? It's lovely. And, you know, the way that was exhibited in that room was a bunch of beanbag chairs.
Right.
And people just rotate in and out and control the mouse and control where you go. That's an incredible way to showcase that game. That's a contextually perfect way to showcase that game. You could also transport that exhibit from a party to
Right.
a space at the Whitney. You
Yes.
know, there are possibilities here. But I think we are so wrapped up in the idea in mainstream popular culture that video games, one, come from the 1980s, and the most important video games that came out are the ones that come from the 1980s, are initially experienced, at least, in an arcade or a public setting, and then also are like really white, really masculine experiences. And it makes it difficult to get, I mean, in the world of media, it's difficult to get people who don't understand video games or don't play video games to understand why you'd ever want to write about these things whatsoever. Unless you have like a really wild story, like that's why a place like the New York Times covers Trombone Champ or something like that, you know, or runs op-eds like, I make predatory video games. I won't let my daughter play them.
Right.
Yeah. Do you know where your children are?
Other questions? Yeah.
That's some from Twitch.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to try to paraphrase this long question from Abed Debe. So, talking about the disconnect between games culture and art culture, they're wondering if one of the reasons for that is because fine art is perceived as a system that is driven by people's desire to accumulate cultural capital, to sort of signal their class position and say like, okay, I'm a fancy person, I belong to like the upper class of taste or wealth. Whereas, and so fine art is something for upper middle class people, and therefore, if you don't buy into that, then you see it as bullshit or pretentious. And that mainstream games culture has kind of taken up a position on the other side of that, where it's sort of like deliberately, quote, unpretentious. What do you think of that? Like, what would you say to somebody whose feelings about fine art are informed by that? Like, I'm not one of those snots. I belong to like video games to the people.
You know, I agree and disagree with that in a large way, because it is so true. The fine arts world, you know, you're either making a financial investment or you're buying something to prove that you have a writer rips. You know, like that's basically what it is. You know, there are ways to appreciate and buy art outside of those contexts, but you know, why does Jay-Z constantly rap about breaking Basquiat's while having sex with Beyonce? Right. You know, like, gentrify your own hood. The man said it. But I will clown on Jay-Z for the rest of my life. Got a tight 5 on Jay-Z. But there's also this thing that needs to be problematized there, I think. It's that the devices you use to play video games, especially in mainstream video games, are luxury objects.
Yes.
The PlayStation 5 I got from work because at the time I had a job, but it costs $500 to get a PS5.
Right.
If you want one with a disc drive, I think it costs even more than that. And they are raising the price. That is not something most people can buy. You also, for these objects to work consistently, need to have access to always-on internet, which even in Brooklyn is an issue.
Yep.
You know, don't love it. You also, you know, if you were a PC purist, well, you know, I've seen those numbers. Everyone always says it's cheaper than a console. It's cheaper than a PS5. You know, it'll last you longer in the long run, but it's very expensive to build a gaming PC, especially a top-of-the-line one, which if you're building one, that is probably the gaming experience you want to have, especially if you're within games culture. You know, it's true that people buy art to signal wealth, but people also buy video games and video game culture, video game consoles especially, to signal their wealth to people. I remember just thinking, my friend told me, my friend Alyssa told me that her partner came home after picking up the PS5 from Best Buy, and he was like, I had to run like the last half a block here because everybody really kept looking at me with this.
No.
The joke at Kotaku when the Switch came out was that they're going to have to write a whole new remix to Annie Up to incorporate people getting jacked for their Switches. Yes. You know? Like, these are as big, as trendy objects as the iPhone when it was initially released. You know, and you mentioned briefly in the beginning, the world of fashion, which has a lot of similar cultural and artistic similarities to the world of fine arts, also is interested in sort of interacting with video games, using video games as yet another way to signal that this is like a higher echelon of society. And I think that video games truly are also middle class and upper class objects. And that's something that I think more people should confront within themselves. You know, we were the family that had the consoles, so other people came over to our house.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, I feel like that's a really worthwhile consideration, because I feel like kind of how I spoke to before, this idea of like what is like high art versus low art, and I feel like in a way, in what you're just describing, is kind of like the people who intentionally dress like they're broke when they're very rich. That kind of is the feeling of video games for me, is this idea of like, we spent a lot of money to just consume trash, like, lovingly, of course,
Yes.
And so I think it's kind of interesting, and I want to say, kind of like pulling off of that question, is like, why do you think we are so invested as video games to seem populist? Because that is just kind of what that vibe is, of like, video games are for everyone. It's not trying to be pretentious. It's not trying to be like so highbrow. But the entry point for it is very expensive.
Yes. But when I graduated from college, I didn't have money to buy a new computer. I was using the same MacBook I used in college. So I had to pitch games places and say, I only have a Mac.
Yes.
Really, really difficult to write about video games if you don't have access to a PC. The most recent console I was an Xbox 360. And we had to get a new TV because we tried playing the most recent Assassin's Creed on it, and we couldn't read the subtitles because our plasma screen TV, it was like not interlacing. It was not. We couldn't read that shit. I think part of this has to do with, one, a reactionary backlash to video games and the diversification of video games, where people say games are for everyone because in the 90s and 2000s, a lot of marketing firms decided to promote the idea that video games were just for boys. And now that this space is opening up once again, because they were never just for boys, there was a reactionary backlash to that idea, to people who feel like their space is being invaded, which it is not. We've just always been here. So a very neoliberal feel-good phrase in response to that is to say, games are for everyone. And to insist that that is true, even past the point of it really making any sense. Because I got one of the last emails I got was the pitch from Blizzard to talk about their new diversity incubator thing for Overwatch League. And it's like, what is the point of a caster or player incubator for women and people of color if there are not, Black and Indigenous people of color in Overwatch League, if there are not women in Overwatch League? They're going to be put into this sort of grinder and then cast out the other side with absolutely no community support to help them. Can we actually say Overwatch League is for everybody if that is the case? No, obviously not. And it's the same sort of economically, where it's the buy-in. There's so many parts of the country that simply cannot play games in the same way that I play video games. I have the ability to play video games in my apartment in New York. And it is really super annoying when I run into this sort of populist idea. Even in really minor forms, like a meme going around Twitter that's like, when's the first time you saw a video game protagonist that looked like you? It's like, I'm freaking still waiting, I'm TikTok, bitch, where are you? And I feel like it is just something that we want to say because it feels really good to say it. It does. But without any action behind it in order to intentionally create those spaces where we are for everyone and to increase accessibility to these works, then it doesn't actually mean anything. I also think that this idea of games being populist has a lot to do also with the financial instability of the industry. We spoke about this previously, but around the same time that we got to know each other, the biggest game in the world was BioShock Infinite. It was a massive hit. It was sold like hotcakes. I would go to Target and see cardboard displays, which you hardly ever see for non-sports games anymore. The commercials everywhere. I'd go to the bar and there'd be commercials for it, and people loved that game. Everybody was playing that game. What happened to that studio? It shuttered because it didn't sell enough copies. And that happens in Hollywood, an industry where, return on investment is very important to people, but it doesn't normally happen after one failed project. And that really was the one failed project, just completely collapsed the studio. So in order to prevent that from happening to your studio, you have to say games are for everyone. And then also to sort of blandly sort of stick to this populist appeal. Because saying that this game, this experience is about a particular thing for particular people, imparts a particular kind of meaning into people, that means that you are closing yourself off from a particular source of revenue. And you can't do that. So every game has to be for everyone.
Right. So I feel like we're going to end there, but I think what the important note is about how important placemaking and space making still is in our industry, because it can be, we can think that like right now, because of so many things that are established and how, further along we feel in our industry, there's still a lot of space missing, or a lot of like generative healthy spaces missing for people, and that there is still a lot of work to be done just to allow things to simply exist. Not even necessarily flourish, but just to exist. And I think that's just an important takeaway for this.
Oh, absolutely. I feel really genuinely, and you can't just relegate it to Slack channels and Discords and Signal chats. Like, you have to eventually meet up with people and talk about things. Mm-hmm. Something that I like doing and have done in the past that I've always wanted to do in the New York game scene is something like bring your own PowerPoint, like a PowerPoint party, where you just do a PowerPoint presentation on anything that you're not currently doing for work. And it's a really fun way to make a little bit of art really quickly, and then talk about that art seriously with other people. Those kinds of experiences where you sit and talk and like really engage one-on-one for an hours-long conversation possibly, those are the ones where I feel like I learn the most from other artists and come away thinking about art in a different and new ways. Because, for my understanding of art, I bring all of my life to some piece of art and learn from it, but I don't know all of the experiences that have happened in yours. Mm-hmm. So meeting other people, interacting with other people about art too, I think it really, it makes you so much less cynical, and I think it just makes the work better and the community better.
Awesome. And that's a lovely note to leave on. Everyone, please join me in thanking Gita for their talk.